session will be recorded. This is the public work session that was posted online and provided to the News Herald for formal discussions regarding the Lake County Public Safety Center. I'll informally kind of call this meeting to order at 9:31 on March the 31st. I have a very brief PowerPoint presentation to script the next 30 minutes, as we do have a commissioners meeting at 10 o'clock, but if the discussion moves a little bit further, I'm sure the commissioners would abide accordingly. Just briefly, the 5 topics we're going to discuss the next 30 minutes. Brief introduction, we all know everyone. The timeline on how we got where we are today. Our results to date. And number 4 is the important part, kind of the committee discussion, thoughts on the 2 finalists of where we are. And then closing the next steps. For the record, if we could briefly go around the room as we are recording this and introduce ourselves. Jason Boyd, Lake County Administrator.
Dave Atkins, Prosecutor.
Mark I, Police Buildings and Grounds.
Craig Berry, Lake County Adult Probation.
Frank Bruno, Sheriff.
Jeff Sherwood, Chief Deputy, Lake County Sheriff's Office.
Cynthia Brooks, Jail Administrator.
Paul Stefanko, Lake County Telecommunications Department.
Ron Young, Commissioner.
John Pletchnik, Commissioner.
John Hammershek, Commissioner.
So thank everyone for attending. And on the board, which I'll read, this was the committee that's worked thus far, including Chief Sherwood. We have a 9-member committee, the 3 county commissioners, the sheriff, Captain Brooks, Chief Berry representing the courts, Paul Stefanko from Telecommunications, Mark I, Police, and myself, Jason Boyd. So these folks have been the ones that have set in a total of 6 interviews thus far, as well as reviewed the initial request for qualifications that were provided in hard copy back in December, actually. Here's our timeline of how we got where we are today. It's crazy to think we're at March 31st in this process from a formal perspective, although we've been talking about the jail for the better part of a decade. We issued an RFQ on November the 19th. This document, which was posted online, sent to the News Herald, was prepared on behalf of the Commissioners and Sheriff with assistance from PMC Consultants and concurrence and review by Mr. Hackman in the Lake County Prosecutor's Office. This was posted for the better part of 30 days up until December 20th was the deadline for interested firms to present or submit, their qualification packets. On the 29th of November of 2021, we did in this room conduct a voluntary pre-application presentation where myself, the Commissioners, the Sheriff, did a 8 or 9 slide presentation on what we know of the current jail, the trends, things that we have learned about the past 10 years to give potential applicants a flavor of what we were looking to do long term. I think we had maybe 5 folks, if I recall, in attendance. We took the better part of January. The committee, I issued each individual a hard copy version of the request for the qualification statements. We received 4 excellent firms of their qualifications: Bowen, DLZ, DLR, and HOK. It took a good amount of time to get everyone's schedules in line with 9 officials here and the firms and their design teams. As you recall, some firms brought about 7 individuals from throughout the United States to these interviews, so that took a little bit of time. Nonetheless, first round interviews were February 22 and 23, and then those interviews, as you guys recall, were scored, sent to me. I calculated the top 2, which ultimately ended up being DLR and HOK, which we concluded those interviews March 23rd and March 24th of this month. Basically, this just summarizes what I talked about. I think it's important to note that not only the committee, but the firm spent a good amount of time talking through their qualifications, our expectations of them, and questions of us, to the point that we scheduled 2 hours, but we afforded all firms the better part of 2.5 hours on each interview that we had. As I noted, we advanced DLR and HOK to the second round of interviews. Once again, 2.5 to 3 hours we spent with each of those firms last week. So that's where we are today, is to discuss in terms of your observations, your thoughts. We are not making a decision today. You will receive a handout from me to score the final 2 firms, and that decision recommendation will be made more than likely at next week's commissioners meeting, where I'll present the findings of the scoring, and then the commissioners will make that decision to authorize me to go into contract negotiations with said firm, and this is an important part for the programming phase of the Public Safety Center. We scripted the RFQ in a two-phase approach. As you know, the program is the most important component, where the firm will dig down into every nook and cranny of the current facility and what the sheriff needs, wants, desires down the road. If we deem that, if the commissioners and the sheriff deem that a success, we have the option then to exercise an agreement to go to criteria architectural services, whereby they will get into schematic and detailed design. This first potential contract next week or thereafter is strictly for the programming phase of this project, and we purposefully put what we call an exit ramp in the contract, so we can go either way. So with that being said, I'm going to just start with kind of my thoughts on HOK and DLR. I think we have a phenomenal problem to work through. All four firms build jails across the country. The two that we selected, from my perspective, had a very good understanding. I think they took the time to research and read the data that we have completed thus far, the studies, the trends that Captain Brooks has provided in as far as population and male versus female. That was one of the factors that got me leaning towards those in my internal review as far as the two finalists, HOK and DLR. As we got into the final round last week, I don't think anyone, once again, this might hurt themselves. I thought they both hit it out of the park. I felt as if DLR may have been a bit more visionary, whereas, which is not a bad thing, and HOK was a little bit more bricks and mortar as far as our intent and where we wanted to do. I think either way we go, we're going to have a successful firm. I'm going to continue to spend time reviewing my notes with both of them. I think it's, like I said, I think it's a good problem to have. I thought the conversation flew a little bit better. As you recall, the second interview was more of a back and forth versus the first one, which was a little more formalized presentation. I felt the flow with HOK was a little bit better, just my take. Once again, not taking anything away from DLR. So that's my opening observations of the finalists. Once again, we're not making a decision today, rather just talking through pros and cons, so that when I hand you your scoring sheet that'll be due next week, all of our thoughts will be on the table on record. So I don't know if the sheriff's team wants to chime in. There's no rhyme or reason to order, so I'll give it to the floor.
I think, I agree with your evaluations. I think that for our purposes, we're looking really at the bricks and mortar aspect. I think we're knowledgeable enough of what's going on around the United States. They can bring in some of that outside knowledge, certainly open to that. Really bricks and mortar as to what we envision for corrections going forward for a justice center, and how can they put together that spatial analysis of what we really need to give us what is a cost, projected cost for this structure. And is that enough moving forward? I thought from HOK's presentation, they had a good concept of that. So, both are great firms and can do a lot for this. So I think we're in a good position to be at, but it's important to move forward. They both illustrated that time is of the essence, not only in terms of interest rates, but also engineers and contractors, availability, and the shortage of that supply in Northeast Ohio is very critical.
I think we spent a lot of time with both finalists. At least I concentrated on the timing, their schedule for the programming phase. I know we want to move expeditiously, as you know, yet not miss any steps. Just reviewing my notes that I took last week, it looked as if DLR's proposal, and obviously both firms said they could compress or expand, we're about 18 weeks in that programming phase. My notes reflect that the HOK team was more, once again, this isn't a design or a win or a lose, was more than 12 to 13 week timeline. Just using what was presented, I mean, that's 6 weeks, a month and a half of potential compression that may be of benefit to the county. So just throwing that tidbit out there as well, because I know we'd spend a good amount of time on how long is it going to take you to get us, because really, and I know that this is of note to the commissioners and finance director made us, that'll give us our first ROM, rough order of magnitude of cost when we get through this programming phase, and maybe even a little bit sooner. Just wanted to throw that out there as I was reviewing my notes over the past few days.
I would add that the overall timelines that were proposed, even though we're obviously only hiring a firm for the programming phase, the goal is to take us through the whole process. HOK did show shorter timelines for the full process when we asked them both to demonstrate, well, what is the quickest turnaround you could give? I don't want to overemphasize that point because both of them said we could go longer or shorter depending on your preferences and needs, but in terms of not just the programming phase, but the beginning to end, cradle to grave project time, HOK did show faster possibilities in their own proposals. I do think that time is much more critical in this project than it is in the ordinary one, not just because of interest rates and inflation, but because we have the Cleveland Clinic and several other counties with large jail projects that are going to eat up virtually every contractor, labor union, engineer, and if we're the last person at the table, frankly, we'll probably be waiting years to be able to get them here. And so, practically speaking, waiting a year probably means waiting 3 or 4 years, and we have to then build in not only the cost of higher interest rates for borrowing, higher materials and supplies costs, because I don't believe this inflation is transitory. I disagree with the Federal Reserve's previous statements. But we also have the issue of the cost of maintaining the current jail. And that has to be built into any formula we have. The more time we need out of that building, the more money we have to put into it in addition to the higher cost of building. So time is quite literally money in this case, and the faster we can turn around this project, the better.
And to that point really quick, I read this morning in the Columbus Dispatch that the Intel project in Central Ohio, the vast majority of the trades are going to make $100,000 because Intel simply is going to pay to get it done. And that's about 3,000 trades workers. So that's another, that amount of money is going to draw a labor market from the Northeast Ohio market. They're going to go down there. So as you said that, it reminded me of the article I read this morning. So. Anyone else?
Well, I would say both DLR and HOK were very in tune with our needs. They both understood and appreciated we wanted a high degree of immunity to obsolescence. I think they both met us where we are. They took the time to research Lake County. They built on their relationships, activities within the county. I preferred the idea of showing us examples that we could learn from and build on rather than examples that would be, well, that's an example of how you don't want to do it. So that was one of my driving thoughts with HOK. They were showing us things that lined up with where we're at, that we want to address mental health, that we want to address addiction, that we want to reduce recidivism. Both talked about it, but I really felt HOK was really honing in on those things that meet our needs now. To the credit of both, they were looking at future needs, things that we may not even be able to see in the next 15, 20, 30 years. But again, that high degree of immunity to obsolescence really impressed me.
I thought HOK, maybe you got to check there. One thing that DLR was interesting in, probably Paul and Mark probably caught it, but the concept of prefabrication offsite, that sort of stuff with these, I think as the United States construction trade, we got spoiled with just-in-time delivery, and I don't think that's going to happen for the foreseeable So that was an interesting trait that I hadn't heard about, but I agree with you.
Man, I remember studying just-in-time inventory in accounting classes. Hot new thing from Japan. And it was a great idea in a world with perfect supply chains and no breaks. You could save a lot of money.
And I appreciate DLR bringing that out. But one of the things that we've said right from the beginning, there'll be a high degree of inspection.
Oh, yeah.
We're not going to make the mistakes we made on the current facility that was literally obsolete the day we took possession of it. And if you're fabricating significant components off-site, who's the inspector? You know, a little bit of caulking and a cool paint job, I can make a weld look mighty pretty. So I'm just using that as an example, but I like the idea of reasonable sub-assemblies coming. I'm not so sure that I want entire modules being dropped in and put together like blocks of Lego. I think there's some inherent risk because we have no control over what happens in these factories. And we've also pledged that we're going to try to have as much of Lake County, or at least our region, people working materials locally sourced. So there's that conflict. But then also, Commissioner Plesher just mentioned, I think, the supply chain. If we're sourcing materials locally and we're sourcing labor locally, there's a higher degree of reliability and timeliness, because that was one of the things, you know, speaking of timelines, I don't think anybody disputed. We're looking at about an escalator of $500,000 a month as we delay. And that, I think, is going to factor into our decision process here as well.
I think to echo Commissioner Hamercheck, I looked into those units that would be made off-site, and one of the biggest points that was made was you have to make sure of quality control. That was the biggest point that they made was, it's a good idea, but you have to have those extra set of eyes looking at it to make sure that you get what you want by the time we receive it on site.
I would echo what Jason said as far as that we need to hit this one out of the park. I think both organizations can do that. I think our goal is going to be who's going to hit it further. And I think that's going to come down to who's going to do the best job for a jail with minimal mistakes. But I think that will come down to what team, because both HOK and DLR were not sole corporations that did all the work themselves. Each one of these groups is a group, and they have engineers that they sub out to, and their structural guys, and their design guys, and their electronic guys are all subs to these guys. And I think it's going to be important that that team fits with Lake County's team, because this go around there will be a Lake County team, where I was here for the last one, and there wasn't a Lake County team. We just gave it to an owner's rep, and the owner rep kind of did it, and it didn't work very well. There was an awful lot of things that didn't get done or got overseen, and I think this go around there has to be a very good team effort. So I think from my point of view, I look at these groups and I look at who will work best with Lake County's employees, because with that cohesive team, I think that we'll get the best product out of that.
Paul, you and I talked about when the proverbial poop is hitting the fan, and we walk in the construction trailer, who's going to be there that we can have a very candid conversation, respectful conversation. And
that will listen to us and not take offense to it, but we'll actually make progress.
right, that'll happen, right? And we're going to have those issues. So I think your point is very.
A project this size, guaranteed there's going to be problems, but who's going to work with us through those problems and get a better product because of it?
Yeah.
And I think that's from my point of view, that would be the outfit that will be the one that will give Lake County the best.
So you're looking, and I agree. Obviously, there's a vast array of disciplines that are going to be designing the jail, drawing. I think it's I think it's the boots on the ground when we're moving dirt into one vertical that's going to be critical from a staff perspective. So I agree with that. So I've taken a good amount of time to review those bios and that sort of stuff.
I think it's going to be, I'm going kind of long here, I think it's going to be an everyday thing. Mark and I have had almost daily conversations about this, about carving out certain amounts of time every week, sometimes every day, to make sure that we're there almost every day, to make sure that we see everything, that we're overseeing everything, and make sure that things don't get overlooked, because they will come back to haunt you 10, 15, even 30 years later. You'll find out that they didn't do this properly, and now it's really now you're gonna pay for it.
Just adding to that conversation, though, the other factor is the gap between the handoff, between who we bring on now and who the architect of record is going to be. The tighter that gap is, the less error, the more we know that we're getting what we thought we were getting. All that diligence that goes into that, that gap is where industry-wide, that's where costs go up, that's where expectations are violated. I really think both teams drilled down on that. I would say, though, that HOK with K2M, they were actually talking about some software to be looking for conflicts and some autonomous checking. You kind of take that human element out. Yes, you'll have the people monitoring it like you would normally expect, but you also have that, well, let's take it right down to the square footage. How do things look in that conflict? I like that idea of the consistency.
Yeah, they had conflict management like from the jump.
Yes, yes, that's something that impressed me. Again, as Jason pointed out, it's a good problem to have when you've got quality companies bidding on things. And it's good to see when they take very similar approaches, but which one is more tailored to us? Which one is going to be more in tune with the needs of the county for the next 40 or even 50 years? But it's that short term, that gap, we can't overlook that. That long vision, important, but sometimes it's that item that's right in front of you that gets overlooked, that bites you right there. Change orders are death.
Well,
And I'm going to look at legal on this. It all comes down sometimes to interpretation. This is what your spec said. As long as it meets that, you're stuck with it. So, don't know if you want to comment on that, but I'll go with true. I'll take that as a win. Commissioner Pleshing, I think you want to say something.
well, this has been a very deliberative process. A lot of homework has been done, and I want to agree with our county administrator that we had 4 very, very substantial firms apply for this task. I think that any one of them could have done the job, but I think that the 2 we're reviewing now, DLR and HOK, are remarkable. They have a strong fit with us. I don't think that we can make a bad choice, but as Mr. Stefanko said, we want to make the ideal choice. It's going to be a hard one because we have 2 very good options. I have done homework, I have checked references, I've reviewed their proposals, and I think that either of them would be exemplary partners in this. And it's entirely possible that in different phases of the process, some of the firms, they have other roles. So it very well may be that we end up working with any or all of these people going forward in this very big project. One conversation that I've had time and time again as we've talked about building our new safety center, which includes the sheriff's department and the jail, is why are we pushing so hard to get this job done? And yes, it's about timing to save money for the taxpayer, but fundamentally it's our oath of office to uphold the law, which requires us to provide a safety center and jail for the county. The debates about whether jails are outmoded or what they should look like in the future, the Ohio Revised Code is a very specific list of requirements for what a jail must be, and people are surprised when they find out all the hoops that have to be jumped through to build this project. That's why this programming phase is so important, because with the exception of a few people sitting on this end of the table, we are not experts in jail minimum standards. And so to build this to the law, not just to fit the needs of Lake County, but to build this according to law is going to take a remarkable firm that has an appreciation for those rules. Debates over jails are political and important debates that need to happen in Columbus and in Washington, D.C., but right here and now, our job is to provide this facility in the most affordable way, which is why we're so diligent in doing this work thoughtfully and quickly, because every month that's waited takes another $500,000 out of the coffers, maybe more. That's probably a conservative estimate. Another $500,000 out of the coffers of Lake County taxpayers. So to get this job done with the least impact and the least burden to the taxpayer requires us to do this homework quickly, We have to do the work, but we can't dilly-dally, we can't hold back, because if we do, it's gonna cost a lot more money as we think about it. We see that kind of political morass in other counties, where people are debating and deciding and trying to push off responsibility on others, but whether we like it or not, the responsibility to get this done falls on the folks in this room, particularly the Board of Commissioners. You shouldn't accept a job that you don't want to do. And it is our job to provide this facility in the most cost-effective way to the taxpayer, to fulfill the needs of the Sheriff's Department in Lake County, not for years, but for many decades to come. I know that 50 years from now, Captain Brooks and the Sheriff are going to be happy in their new facility. They'll be there a very long time, so we need to make sure that it meets their needs. But my principal concern is that the firm we pick meets with the Sheriff's approval. So I guess I would pose to you, do you have any closing thoughts on which firm we should choose, both firms in general, because I want to make sure that we are serving the Sheriff's Department in making this choice.
It's a difficult call, but personally, I'll be trying to select HOK.
Thank you.
As long as we're fleshing this skeleton out a little bit, I also want to say how important it was that they brought team members that were respectful of all facets of our needs. They clearly drilled down on the brick and mortar with Mark and Paul as far as buildings and grounds and telecommunications. But Chief Barry, the interactions with the courts, your group, I think that was essential. If you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think the key component, and we've all touched base on this, is that programming phase. And we all know what we need today. It's what do we need 10, 20, 30 years from now? Not just essentially housing folks, but servicing the courts, servicing the other communities in Lake County. And I think you have to look at it and say, which team is going to meet with our frontline workers and pull that information out. What is the needs that we have right now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now? And I'm going to kind of echo what the sheriff, I think HOK will find those needs out of our frontline workers. I think they'll work better with our frontline workers as a team and get the total vision of what this project looks like today, as well as 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now.
And Chief Sherwood, one of the things that we drilled down on was this actual support of the Sheriff's office itself.
Yeah.
And physical security of the site.
Right, we certainly didn't want that lost. I think HOK, you look at and review the notes, they really honed in on that as well, that we're not just building a jail, we're also building a whole other section of police agency and sheriff's office that would be very responsive to the community that it serves.
And if I could just add one thing, if anybody else wants to comment on this, I was pretty adamant that we need to be on the same page, same book, using the correct terms. If they're going to use terms of art, make sure that we understand what those terms mean and what their applications are. I'm going to say HOK, K2M, they switched, like I said, they got it. They quit using what I'm going to say jargon, but again, terms of art. DLR, they tried. They were a little set in their ways from what I could see, but they were adjusting. But
Is there a requirement? Can we do a selection here, or do we have to do it?
The actual vote is obviously up to the county commission.
No, I mean, in terms of our committee recommendation.
You're going to get a scoring sheet, each of the 9 members, and you'll simply rank 1 or 2. I don't need them today, but I just want them by next Tuesday.
And this is our public opportunity to be
Yeah.
discussing our thoughts and
Yeah, so-
feelings on it.
You need the scoring sheet.
So just, does anyone, before I get to this, to your, David, I didn't speak, but the actual recommendation won't take place even though.
Oh, I understand.
Yeah.
It's not with this committee, but we recommend
Correct.
our evaluation.
So I'll get 9 sheets.
To the commissioner.
Yeah, and I'll get my theorem out, figure out how to add up how many ones we got.
Okay.
And make a formal recommendation. And the process will be, we've talked about it, the first and second bullet points, third bullet point, assuming the commissioners are on this timeline, I will do a SIG file correspondence reflecting this meeting and providing a recommendation of the selection committee for considerations for me to proceed with contract negotiations with said firm. We already have a draft, and Mr. Hackman has already been reviewing it, a draft programming contract ready to go, so it's not going to be another 2 months. We've tried to keep the paperwork moving to keep this process to the commissioners and your objectives. Let's not pick up on it and have 2 months of negotiation.
Right.
I don't think it's going to take that much time between Mr. Hackman's office, PMC's office. I think the document's in pretty good shape, Dave. Yes. So we can proceed.
Great.
And it's a simple scoring, choice 1, choice 2.
That's it.
It's literally that.
I was, real quick, I was a little bit, I'm torn on these. I mean, they both seemed excellent, but DLR did concern me a little bit. They just did a fantastic presentation. Very professional, very articulate, everything very well laid out. They brought real expertise to the table, a lot of folks. But at one point, they seemed so emotionally entangled in some things. For instance, at one point Seattle came up. Just a brief discussion about Seattle. You had a really, I thought, funny comment on Seattle, how, well, they like to burn things up there, John said. And I don't know who it was, but their nuts and bolts guy, what was his name? He was really on top of things as far as the details of the technology that need to run the jail. He was the guy that helped choose where to get the parts.
No, their electrical engineer that said about here.
Yeah.
Nielsen. Mr. Nielsen.
Nielsen,
Chris
yeah.
Nielsen.
He reacted just, I mean, he was emotional about that. He looked at John, he was, I don't know if you noticed it, he was infuriated. He just,
I think
well,
that's
that doesn't happen in Wilmington or whatever, something that's close to Seattle. And his reaction was just, he couldn't control himself for just a minute there. He was really, really concerned about that. So that concerned me about future interaction with him. If you don't agree with him, I wonder, where you'd be at. And yet at the same time, he seemed to really relate well to you guys that work with this stuff on a daily basis, Paul. I thought you and him were hitting it off pretty well there.
Now that you brought that up, one of the things that DLR brought up, and I know we're running short on time.
No.
One of the things that DLR brought up was that we're going to build whatever you guys want. We're going to do it your way. We're going to build whatever you want. And as I told Mark, and I think I told Jason, then Chris came up and said, "This is how we're going to do it." And I said, "Wait a minute. You just said that you're going to build whatever we want, however we want, but this is the way we're going to do it." And to me, that was a contradiction. So I was a little funny about that. I didn't take that very well. It's still a great company. I mean, I think DLR's they make very nice. They build beautiful jails. But again, as I mentioned before, I think it's going to be a team fit. Who's going to fit the best working with Lake County? And if we know that there's potential conflict before we even hire them, I would be concerned with that.
At the same time, HOK didn't impress me with sort of the power of their presentation. They didn't seem to back what they said with a lot of in-depth views of what it was that we were trying to achieve. Whereas, well, DLR really went out of their way to address what I thought were some of our specific concerns. So I'm still kind of up in the air about it. That, there were some specific things about DLR that concerned me.
Comments? It's been a great conversation.
Very good. We're there, sir.
Yeah, so just to reiterate, I will hand these out to you. If you can get them back to me by next Tuesday. Commissioners, the plan of attack will be for me to have a SIG file correspondence mid next week for your consideration. Continue to work with the prosecutor's office on the draft contract. And I know I've talked to the sheriff, Mark and Paul know this, the commissioners, you know, if and when we proceed, we gotta buckle in, this is gonna be a ride. From this building, which is an office building, I know the amount of time that it took from your top level managers every day, every week. And we're all gonna have to get thick skin, because it's gonna be, you know,
Committed.
yes, committed's the right word, so,
Passionate.
passionate.
We used that word in our 2 meetings with HOK and DLR, and I'm sorry for interrupting
No.
you, but, I'm not gonna speak for Mark, but we're in.
Yeah.
And this is an opportunity to get that stone out of my
We're
shoe
gonna
that
have
I'm walking
t-shirts
with
made.
for 30
We're gonna
years.
catch playoffs made.
And that's gotta go away. You know, we have to get this right. We have a perfect example of what not to do.
Well, and we have a perfect example. I did hear from a couple of the firms on, I can't believe there were 3 county commissioners at our meetings. And then I said, well, I think that reflects the sincerity. And I said, not only did you have 3 commissioners, you had the sheriff, his top managers. I said, we had our court representative, he's the chief, so I told these firms, you had the who's who of the decision makers in the room. So that's feedback that I got last week from a couple firms, that they don't typically see that in other, what I would call, let's say, large county. So thanks to you guys for getting there this far. So that's all I have for this morning. Good?
Thank you.
Thank you. Meeting closed.